Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second session of the 2023 GEM Viet Nam webinar series. Today, we have the pleasure to welcome Dr. Guilherme Magacho, who is Senior Macroeconomist at the French Agency for Development, and who will present the work on Vietnam's green industrial path between carbon and climate exposures. This presentation corresponds to the part 2 of the GEM Vietnam National Report. So today's discussant is Dr. Danilo Sartorello Spinola, who is senior lecturer in economics at Birmingham City University, and who has a PhD on innovation, structural change, and economic complexity. So the presentation will last about 30 minutes. Then we have a time for discussion between Dr. Magacho and Dr. Spinola, and then the discussion will be open to the rest of the audience. Of course, you can ask questions in the chat during the presentation. Please do feel free to do it. And now let's start. Guilherme, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Manuel, for the presentation. I will share my screen here. Okay, 1 minute. Okay, perfect. Are you hearing me well and can you see my screen? Perfect. Well, this presentation, as Manuel said, is the second chapter of the macro report of Vietnam. And basically, we developed this study with it was me at D, Etienne Spain at the time at D, Irene Decher, Grégoire Sampin, and Michel Simoni. The idea here is just to introduce first what is the STEAM approach, which is the approach that we adopt to analyze the case of Vietnam. Show the two types of exposure that we're going to analyze. First, the transition exposure, what happens if the country, all countries in the world go into this transition, and what's the consequence for Vietnam. And then the climate exposure, and we do here climate exposure to 2 degrees. Let's assume that the temperature increased by 2 degrees. And of course, for every single country, the story is going to be different, as we have been discussing many of the other studies in the other chapters. And finally, we discuss a little bit on the opportunities that may emerge from this change, the structural change, is going to classify it, and the technological opportunities for the country. Well, basically, the STEAM approach, which is the approach that we're adopting here, assume that we have a low carbon transition in the world, and this low carbon transition, led by policies, led by technological change, is a unique type of structural change. Why it's a unique type of structural change? Because it's very fast, different from all the other structural change that you have in the world, where it takes time. This structural change was it's happening very fast. Low emission industries will grow, green industries in general, but high emission industries, what we call here sunset industries, declining industries, they will lose importance through time. And of course, countries will be impacted differently according to the structure of production, trading, finance. If the countries depend more on these industries in terms of the production, there will be some impacts. In terms of trade, there will be some other impacts. And financially, if these countries depend on these industries, the cascade impacts will be completely different. We also look at the capacity of the country to the importance of adapting to this structural change, the climate impacts, because not only the structural change will come from the, let's say, the demand side, whether industries will grow or decline because the world demand is changing, because technologies are changing, and the inputs and machineries to produce are changing, but also there are some industries, some sectors that will be more impacted than others. And this is specifically, it's not like a general thing in the world, but it changes by country. As you're going to see, agriculture will be impacted differently in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, or China, or Japan, or even Latin American countries, but also other sectors, other industries will be impacted. For example, we're going to discuss tourism, depending on the increase in temperature in the country and the current temperature in the country, tourism will lose or gain importance. Well, basically in this approach, we analyze three aspects, three types of, let's say, three dimensions that are relevant for developing countries. And why we took these three dimensions, especially because they are usually the main issues that constrain the structural transformation in developing countries. First, for promoting the transition itself, because you need to import inputs, because you need to import machineries, countries need to raise foreign currency for exchange, because if they need to import a lot of things, they need to export a lot of things. They need to create some possibilities to export to import. And to avoid this balance of main constraints, they need to raise foreign currency. They need to raise foreign exchange. Well, they need also to avoid fiscal imbalances. Well, the transition itself will demand a lot of public investment in green infrastructure. There will be a lot of expenses from retraining workers that they're going to move from these brown or like sunset industries to green industries, to sunrise industries. And of course, like if countries depend on these industries to raise fiscal revenue, basically there will be an issue. If they depend on sunset industries to raise fiscal revenues, they can face some fiscal imbalances. And finally, the socioeconomic aspect that is extremely relevant if we're talking about developing countries. Well, basically, even though most of the studies are saying that because green industries are more labor intensive than traditional fossil fuels or metal industries that are the sunset industries, or like heavy metal industries, well, the impact on employment and wages is going to be positive overall. But this is definitely not homogeneous across countries. There will be countries that will benefit from this structural change, and some countries that will face a lot of challenges. And then we need to analyze this from this perspective. The basic approach that we use, the conceptual framework, like let's say for this analysis, is the environmental multi-regional input-output tables. What is an input-output table and why we use these? Input-output tables, they show the interrelation between all the selling and buying industries. So for example, if in buying industries we have cars, they show how many inputs you need to produce this car, like engines, tires, but it also shows that for producing these engines, for producing tires, for producing I don't know, all the parts and components of a car, you need also inputs. You need plastic, you need metals, you need, let's say, and then you have like, you can trace all the value of production, the production chain of these industries. And it also, because it's an environmental input-output table, it not only shows the productive interrelation, but the physical interrelations. So how much land, water, energy, minerals you need to produce these goods, and also how much are emitting in terms of GHG, greenhouse gases, and also other pollutants like or a waste and dirty water. So it's like, okay, for example, the case of water, you use like blue water to produce, and it creates dirty water in the end. If you want to see more details on the let's say the technical issues and how we develop this analysis, we just published a paper where you can scan here and see exactly what is the method behind, and explains a little bit on this hypothetical structural method, which is basically assuming that what happens if we don't produce anymore fossil fuels, for example. We stop producing coal. what happens with other industries, what happens with all the economy if theoretically we stop producing coal. And we use this Gloria multi-regional input-output database, which was released 1 year ago in March 2022, which is basically, we're talking about 164 countries, so the coverage is huge. And we're talking about like 120 sectors. So it's like within industries, you can see exactly what is the industries that are most relevant for them. Well, let's go through the, let's say, the specific case of Vietnam. We can divide the emissions in at least 3 scopes. It's like basically scope 1 is the direct emission, so the industry itself is emitting, which is this gray part here. The indirect emissions from energy, from power. So the scope 2 is basically how much emissions, greenhouse gas emissions you have from coming from power, and the other indirect emissions. So, for example, with I don't know, for producing in construction, for example, we use cement, and cement is very emitting. Not because of energy, of course, there is some emissions in energy, but the production of cement itself is very emitting. So it's indirect emission, indirect in the sense that is like I'm producing a good, and it's that construction, for example, a building. I'm constructing a building, but to produce the cement that was used to produce this building, I was emitting. So I'm considering all the embodied emissions. And when we see the emissions, the CO2 emissions, actually, we can do this for CO2, we can do for like greenhouse gases, or like we can use this for land use as well. But when you see the emissions, we see that electricity is the main, let's say, emitting industry in Vietnam. That's true. As expected, electricity is like a little bit dirty in Vietnam, and the emission intensity is very high. So it's an important sector in terms of emission. But civil construction, like if you sum up here, civil construction, other construction like infrastructure in general, other industries that are necessary to produce this construction, to produce construction in general, produce the buildings and the infrastructure are also very emitting, especially when we're accounting for these indirect impacts. Well, so basically, we cannot just look at energy. You need to go beyond energy. And that's why we identify what we say the sunset industries. The sunset industries, of course, electricity is here in this the left hand. We have like the downstream emissions, so the emissions that after the production, what is the emissions that happens? So, for example, mining and quarry, where you have like production of coal, production of oil, production of gas. They are not very emitting. They are in terms of emitting within the industry is medium, but they present a very high upstream emission, downstream emission, which means that they are used in industries where they are very emitting, which are very emitting, so that we can consider this industry as a sunset industry, not because it's, of course, it's very carbon intensive, but mainly because, and this is what determines this in this case, mainly because this industry is emitting, not in the industry itself, but once it's produced, the use of this industry is generating a lot of emissions. And we do this for all sectors in the economy. And basically we classify 4 types of, for like great sectors, like large sectors, with which are very emitting. In mining and quarry, we have, for example, fossil fuels, iron ores. In the petroleum, chemical, and non-metallic mineral products, we have, like, of course, petroleum. We have some specific chemicals like fertilizers. We have like some specific non-metallic minerals like cement. Metal products, of course, like there are metals that are extremely important for the transition, but there are metals that are that will lose importance in the next years, or the technology that we're using today is not good enough. And then if the economy depend on these industries, they will face some issues because they will need to invest a lot in transforming these activities. And of course, electricity, gas, and water is the sector, but it's like basically electricity and gas from fossil fuels is a sector that is extremely emitting and can consider as from fossil fuels, of course, as a sunset industry. Well, when you look at Vietnam, these lines here, these dashed lines, are the 20% more dependent industries. So Vietnam is very close in the left-hand side here. 1 second. Vietnam is very close to this line, very close to this dashed line. It means that almost here, I think it's a little bit like 13% of the exports, the raise of foreign revenue in Vietnam is on these industries. In terms of tax revenue, Vietnam is not very dependent on these industries, but is close, not so far from this line. When you look at here, we see the comparison between Vietnam and other countries, and the external exposure of Vietnam is coming mainly from mining and quarrying, basically extraction of fossil fuels. But when you look at the fiscal exposure, which is basically taxes, we can see that these are only the very, very, very high dependent exposed economies. So Vietnam is very dependent on chemicals, where you have petroleum, for example, but also indirect impacts. So these industries that are producing machineries and inputs for those industries that are sunset industries. Well, in terms of socioeconomic dependence, we have that employment is not very important in these industries in Vietnam. It's about like a little bit more than 2% of unemployments are in these industries, but wages are very important. So what we can see here is basically Vietnam is like very close to, it's actually it's more than like this dashed line, which is the 20% more exposed economies. It means that the good jobs, the well-paid jobs are in these industries. So, and of course, like if you look at the color of the point, we see that the country has this is SPC's social protection coverage. The country has low levels of social protection coverage, which means that it's very exposed to the transition, but it's also very dependent on the need for changing the social security system to guarantee that these people that will lose or may lose their jobs will not face some social issues. A comparison with other Southeast Asian countries, we have here Vietnam, like in the first here in the top. Basically, we have like Indonesia, Myanmar are more exposed than Vietnam, and Thailand, Malaysia are like close to Vietnam in terms of exposure. The difference is that Vietnam is a little bit more exposure if you look at wages here. Socioeconomically, especially more than Myanmar, close to Indonesia, but it's not very exposed from the external perspective as Indonesia and Myanmar. This is a comparison, and if you see Philippines, Laos, Cambodia, they are much less exposed. Here's a world map showing the different dimensions of exposure, and basically what we have is that Vietnam is here, this blue country here. It's a country that is extremely socioeconomic exposed, as we just discussed before. When you look at the exposure to the damages, exposure to climate change, we had to build like what we call like climate damage functions. So we use because we cannot consider that all sectors will be impacted in the same way and all countries will be impacted in the same way. So we basically define these 5 types of sectoral climate impacts: agriculture, fisheries, energy, tourism, and sea level rise. Sea level rise will have like a significant impact due to flood, the risk of floods. So there will be capital destruction. Tourism, as I explained before, the demand for tourism may drop, especially in countries that are warm. Energy, there is supply side impacts that will be very relevant. Fisheries, of course, like the increase in sea temperatures may reduce the availability of fish for some countries. And in terms of agriculture, some yields are either they will be completely destroyed or they will lose productivity. And here, Vietnam appears as a very exposed economy in terms of raising foreign exchange and in terms of raising fiscal revenues. Of course, there are some countries that will be more impacted, especially small islands because of the flood, the risk of flood. But Vietnam and most of the Southeast Asian countries will be very exposed, are very exposed to this from these two perspectives. The same story from the socioeconomic perspective: employment, wages. Vietnam is, again, a country that is very exposed in this sense, which means that the case of Vietnam, we are talking about a country that we need to care a lot in terms of both in the risks of transition, because the country depends a lot on these sunset industries, and in the risk of climate change, because the country is very dependent on industries that will be impacted by the climate change itself. This is the, let's say, the challenges, but the good story is that Vietnam, and here's the green complexity potential, is the complexity, the capacity of the country to move to green industries based on what the country is producing nowadays. And if you find Vietnam here, Vietnam was here in like say the rank was a little bit like close to 100, and the country during like the last decade, the decade before, has increased a lot in terms of this potential, and now it's among the most, like the top 50 most. We're talking about 200 countries, and it's among the top 50 countries with the higher green complexity potential. What does it mean? It means that the country has a capacity, a great capacity to move to these green industries. So we need to look at these at two figures, basically. We need to understand that the country is extremely dependent on sunset industries and industry in sectors that will be damaged by the climate change. But the country also has an increasing and great potential to migrate to green industries. This is basically a comparison of Indonesia, Korea, Thailand, and Vietnam. Just to conclude, the case of Vietnam is quite interesting because, like, of course, like the case of Korea is very interesting from the point of view that the country can produce. It's very complex in terms of the green complexity and the capacity to produce complex green products, which are those that this is the PCI, is the level of complexity of the product. So the higher is the complexity of the products, the higher is the capacity of Korea to produce. While Vietnam presents like a higher capacity to produce less complex goods, green goods, but still these goods, like we here we have like different types of goods, like goods that will be basically important for the transition, like bikes. Bicycles are important for the transition because if you want to pursue a transition, we need to think about non-motorized transportation. And Vietnam is a country that has the capabilities to produce and these less complex but still very important goods for the transition. So thank you very much. Here you can download the report if you want. The second, the macro report, and this chapter is basically the second chapter. This is a very brief introduction. The chapter is much more detailed than this, with the discussions on every single graph. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Guilherme. So now we will move for the discussion part with Dr. Spinola. So Danilo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank Marie-Noëlle, Nguyen, and Guilherme for the invitation, and also thank AFD for inviting for this event. It is a pleasure and to discuss such an interesting and important topic. And I read the chapter and in detail and try to understand exactly every aspect. Can you hear me? Yeah, and try to understand every aspect of the model. And so I have a lot of comments, things that are more in the general sense, things that we can discuss in a more general sense, and things that we may discuss in a more detailed sense, perhaps for future debates as well. So I try to divide my comments into a big discussion looking at elements of supply in terms of micro, meso, macro, demand, and also in terms of institutional economics, international economics, and political economy, because I think we can discuss all these broader areas in the debate. Because I try to kind of summarize a research question, like as a researcher, we all try to do that. We summarize a research question from the chapter, and the question that came to my mind is how to achieve a structural change and technology upgrading that's necessary for the green transition. At the same time, you have to protect the labor market under balance of payments constraints in a global value chains-led environment. So with a lot of discussion, a lot of debates that the GVC were not there, but I mean, considering that Vietnam is such an important element in the context of the country, I myself added this part to the question. But in terms of the supply side, the first thing is starting by the Magazo, because this is what we mainly discuss in structural change, like the sectoral recomposition of the economy. Looking at the supply side characteristics, it seems clear that the most CO2 emitting is the energy sector, which is expected. And also there's something quite interesting in the chapter that says that especially the renewable sources such as hydropower are actually being the ones suffering the most with the climate change. So in one sense, you could imagine that transitioning towards this kind of specific sector would be very relevant for a country such as Vietnam with all the fluvial analysis. On the other hand, it is particularly risky to move to sectors in which the climate change will end up resulting into a reduction of the possibilities of positioning yourself. So I was trying to think about this kind of structural change in the sense of, okay, we think about what sectors we can move towards, but first, what kinds of capabilities and absorptive capacity Vietnam has to do so? Second, can you do it in the context of global value chains and the context of all the requirements that the value chains are requiring? Third, the balance of payments constraints of the country will demand you to import most of the technology that comes from abroad, which will end up increasing very much the constraints to the macroeconomic dynamics of the economy. And in the model, in the STEAM model, it captures very well that, and something extremely interesting to see that it is embedded in the model. And also in terms of the governmental fiscal space, and to do that. And is there interest to do so? And this is something I was thinking about, because this is the debate that goes back to other developing countries, that go back to India, it's a debate that goes back to Africa. What are the socio-economic forces that are interested into pushing this agenda? I'm not saying that this agenda is not important for everyone. Everybody would say that it is. However, in order to reach this specific agenda, you have to give up something. And you have to give up something in the short run, or some social groups will have to give up something in the short run in order to get something that may be uncertain in the long run, but necessary. Obviously, we advocate for the green transition, and we see the relevance it is, but it is costly. And it is costly in terms of social groups that will lose, and not only the workers that will lose like the high-skilled workers in the fossil fuel industries that will lose their jobs and will have to reallocate themselves, but also to the capital owners, the firms that own this specific that are own the specific sunset industries and have been pushing forward to maintaining this pattern. We've seen that even the US, like with the fossil fuels discussion, and in the UK. So I can imagine that in many, well, I can imagine, I'm sure in many developing countries, this is the same. There is kind of social groups that will try to hinder this process. So how to create the consensus on that is also a discussion. It's not in the paper, because it's not the aim of the paper, but this, as a discussant, I think I may bring like many different topics that we can talk about. So what are the political economy behind it in which we can create this consensus? In terms of the international dynamics, something that came quite clear in my mind, like how to fund and finance this transition. For instance, let's get the example that is very well known for Latin American scholars, how the industrialization in many developing, many Latin American countries. How did you start the process of industrialization? First, you had a preferable international environment that allowed you to bring foreign resources. Second, you had the exports of some natural resources, such as coffee, that allowed you to create some kind of resource in foreign currency and let you start the process of industrialization by bringing foreign capital goods. And these foreign capital goods, in the context of green transition, will be those that will allow the country to move towards the new sectors, the sunrise sectors that we so much aim at achieving. So you relied on those natural resources. You rely on the products that you sell. Of course, Vietnam into the global value chains is already more upgraded in that sense. It's not a purely agricultural economy, as we discussed in the beginning of Latin American and African development. But the fact that you still need to create a basis that, in order for you to transition, you need to rely on what you have. And sometimes what you have will not allow you to transition. So you create kind of a very difficult environment. I'm putting barriers, but I think the opportunities are enormous. But I'm putting the barriers just for us to bring them to the debate. And also, in order to overcome these barriers, it's fundamental to build capabilities, right? And thinking about the Schumpeterian dynamics. Because one thing is only importing capital goods, which is what we discuss on green transition, especially for countries that do not have the technology or produce the technology that is in the forefront. But how to adapt, how to absorb, how to learn from these new technologies that are being built, so the countries that are entering the global value chains try to upgrade themselves and also be able to create and engage into the technological race. So you don't technological upgrading to, it's the same idea that once you upgrade, the world's already advancing. So you keep upgrading and the world keeps advancing because you're always lagged. So how to endogenously create a system that will foster technological change inside the country. So creating absorptive capacity, developing the national system of innovation, creating engagement between micro actors, between universities, between firms, so all this big discussion ends up coming up in different layers, from the macro balance of payments constraints to the meso-structural change and to the micro idea of creating and overcome a national system of innovation, creating the absorptive capabilities. And this is only the supply side. So looking only at the supply side, but of course, and Guilherme brought really well, we have the demand side, which is also something that is particularly important for us to understand, because if you run out of foreign reserves and you don't have money to buy dollars, I'm thinking about US dollars. If you don't have US dollars to buy foreign capital goods, you can't buy them in your domestic currency, unless you are perhaps Switzerland, UK, or the Euro area that have currencies that are a bit more accepted internationally. Only if local currency in developing economies, you are not able to engage directly into the international markets. So you need to have foreign currency. Foreign exchange is fundamental. And how you find this specific foreign exchange is also central. You can do a strategy of trying to bring more portfolio flows, raising interest rates and try to attract more portfolio flows. So you have a basis of foreign currency. However, this is a short-term solution for a long-term problem. If we're talking about structural change, you demand investments, and investments, until they're mature, they have a long time span. So you can't rely on portfolio flows. You have to attract foreign direct investment, which you with the global value chains is what's going on, or you have to find a way through changing your export basis and your import basis. So you import less of the products that are high value capture, and you produce products with higher value capture. You end up producing. It's kind of a, I know people don't like this. It's kind of import substitution, but in the way of upgrading. So you can upgrade on that, on that scale. So this, from the demand side, we have this issue on balance of payments, but we also have the issue of the scale of the domestic market, right? Because once you are connected in an international global environment, most of your consumer market is outside. So you have an export-led growth, but how to develop the domestic? Because I mean, why are we talking about development and green transition? Because we want to improve the life quality, the life conditions of our populations. So we can drink good quality water, so we can have good education, so we can improve the salaries, we get a good welfare state to everyone, and we can generate growth, and that people can improve the life conditions with sustainability in terms of environmental, social, and economic terms. So thinking about that, how do we like, I'm not putting questions, I'm putting the elements here to debate, because there are challenges, but there are many opportunities. And the opportunities are going to that direction. The emerging economies are the ones that are actually growing faster for a long time. There are regions that are not growing, but the East Asia is actually the region of the world that has been growing fast, and South Asia and East Asia are so there are many opportunities in terms of entering and becoming a country that can rely and give all of this system of development to its population. But how to transition between this global-led system in which you end up benefiting through low cost of labor, to a system in which you can upgrade, you can produce on the forefront, and you can learn, adapt, and create technologies that are able to lead you to green transition, and at the same time generate growth and development. So it's a big question, I know, but I think the chapter is really nice because it brings all of these elements into question. Some of them I highlight for myself, political economy and global value chains, but all the rest is like being debated very thoroughly. So I really praise Guilherme and the people from AFD for the chapter. It gives a very good general framework. And what I think is mostly interesting is the fact that you focus on the sectors that are the ones that the country needs to have a further look. And this is particularly important because you need to get better a green structural change in that specific. If you don't solve those specific basic sectors, and it is a challenge for everyone. I mean, people are talking about coming back to nuclear energy, and you all are very aware of this discussion because in a way to find a solution for the energy problem, and so we can get away from fossil fuels and get less dependency on countries in regions that with a lot of volatility in terms of political volatility. So I think I'll stop here because I bring out all of those elements, but I just want to praise again all the work that's done by AFD. It's really amazing what you guys have been doing recently. And thank you again for the invitation. And if I'll be happy to discuss all details on the model in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Danilo, for your comments. I think like you understood exactly the points of the paper that we want to bring. It's not that we want to bring like all the answers, but and it's not that we want to say, okay, it's not possible, but we need to know the challenges to address them. So, and one of the main challenges that we face when you're talking about like this kind of transition, as you clearly put into the discussion, is exactly the balance of payment issues and the social issues that emerge. Because like most of the countries that engage into industrial transformation, industrialization, you know, they failed. Unfortunately, most of the countries failed in this transition pattern because they didn't care enough with this issue, which is central, because basically that's the story. Like, if you want to promote a transformation, a change in the economy, like a green transformation, let's say, you need to know that we're going to, by doing this transformation, by doing this change, we need to know that you're going to need a lot of imported goods. Of course, like in the medium and long term, you can start producing this photovoltaic cells. You can start producing the all the equipment necessary for the transition. But in the short term, like when you start the transition, there is the need for import. And this is something that we really care about and we need to understand. Actually, just like a spoiler, we are developing a dynamic version of this model that we applied for Vietnam to understand, okay, what's happening if the country engages into transition, how much the different types of transition. Of course, there is no one thing as low carbon transition, but bringing different scenarios, bringing different strategies, how much it's needed, how much imports, how much fiscal investment, public investment is needed for the transition. Is the country capable of financing this by producing the same thing that they are producing before? And I think in the case of Vietnam is a very interesting case, because Vietnam was able in from the 2000s, end of 90s, 2000, early 2000, to promote some very, very relevant structural change in the economy. Actually, Vietnam was like a poor country at the time, and now it's like okay, it's not rich as Norway, but it's still like it's a much richer country. And industrialization was central in this. And the country has this potential, these capabilities, some of them, of course, like it has to develop even more but it has like started this story and was able to, at some point, create the conditions for starting the transition. And this new transition, because like in the 90s, 2000s, the country was moving from like agrarian economy to industrial economy and was like capable of doing this. And then this new transition will demand other investment, creation of other capabilities. And as very well pointed by you, Danilo, is the socioeconomic forces are very relevant. At that time, there was like a consensus, not a consensus, but it was like, okay, the country was able to, at some point, create the institutional framework to guarantee that and to show for everybody that industrialization will be positive even for those that are benefiting from natural resource exporters. And now it's the same story. Like we need to understand that, of course, like not everybody will win the same, like will profit the same, but if you are engaged, the country has a policy, a structural policy, like as like people from CEPAL used to say, like you have like this green big push. The government will say, okay, we're going to this direction, be prepared, because this is going to be like Vietnam in 2050, 2050. This is going to be like Vietnam in 2040. This is going to be the country. And then you need to know that these are the public procurement possibilities. These are the industries that will grow. Be prepared for that. So it has to be something very organized, very coordinated, and there's no other way of doing this. It's not going to be like the market forces that will lead to this transformation. We need some coordination, because like this coordination clearly clarifying these objectives and bringing these objectives from a green transition is something that Vietnam was able to do in terms of the industrialization, and I really think that the country can do now in terms of the green transition. But this is needed, and this is needed because either the country is going to do this from now on, now that it has the capabilities, now that has like, or we're going to lose this opportunity. And then it's going to be like more and more difficult to get into these new policies. So this is like a kind of knife-edge problem, because most of the developing countries have. It's like kind of like either you move to something that is quite complicated to move into, which is the green transition, or you're going to be stuck into a brown country that's not going to be able to, for example, as you said, like to sell the products anymore in the international markets, because like you need scale, you need to be like your products need to be accepted in the international market for you to grow, to create this dynamics of the demand dynamics and engage the economy into this transformation. And if you don't do this, basically this like window of opportunity will be lost, and then it's going to be like more and more difficult to do so. But thank you very much for your comments. I think it's like very precise in the sense that you really understood the idea of the paper, you really understood the chapter, you really understood what we want to bring with this. It's definitely not to say we have a problem. No, it's like we have challenges, but we have conditions to face these challenges. And I really think that it has been very interesting to work with the Vietnam issues, because we see that it's a country that is teaching other countries how to move towards this industrialization, and now green industrialization. I don't know, Marina, if you want to open the floor for other questions, or Danilo, if you want to comment.
Maybe Danilo, if you want to react very briefly, and then we open to the rest of the audience.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the answers as well. Yes, I definitely agree. And this is perhaps one of the biggest challenges in this open financial flow system that we have today. How to build a consensus that countries need to move forward with a development strategy that demands or requires a bit more of a longer time span, if we're always constrained by the short run, right? We always need to guarantee that we don't have a runaway of capital flows, that we do a monetary policy that is quite strict, that's quite controlled, that's always focusing on controlling inflation and curbing inflation. And we try to use the exchange rate in order to control this and lose a bit of our competitiveness by trying to control, aiming at a very tightened monetary policy. And now with monetary policies being tightened in the global north, that has many impacts also to the global south in order of macro managing of their monetary policies. So these are the challenges, right, that the countries are facing right now. And I entirely agree that if the idea of bringing challenges is not to say it is impossible. The idea of bringing challenges says like, we need to understand what kind of obstacles we have, so we don't, in the process of trying to go through a development strategy, we don't feel like we are unannounced and we don't get surprises. It's like a preparation for something that we know it may come, and we hope it comes. And I think Vietnam is definitely teaching the world on how to, in this context of supply chains and etc., how you upgrade. It's perhaps the best example of a country that managed to upgrade since the Korean and the Chinese cases. So I think Vietnam is a top one. So it is given a lot of examples, but the challenges are still very much there, right? You can upgrade, but you're not in the technological race yet. I do think Vietnam will reach the technological race. It's going in the direct path, but as Guilherme is saying quite well, you need to understand the challenge to reach that. And once the challenges are being put, be prepared to face, and with a good strategy. So with a good strategy, you can always protect and anticipate the problems. And thank you again. Thank you for the opportunity to talk.
Thank you very much to both of you. So now we open the discussion to the rest of the audience. So you have two ways to ask questions. Either you can ask some question writing in the chat, or you have a button normally at the bottom of your screen where you can raise your hand so that we allow you to speak directly. So of course questions can be either to Guilherme or to Danilo.
in the meantime, just like comment, sorry for like talking so much, but we talk a lot about like the transition side, but in terms of like these industries that sunset industries that are facing like constraints in world demand, like fossil fuels. But in the specific case of Southeast Asian countries, which are like, the countries that will be, of course, like besides the small islands that may disappear, the countries that are facing the most severe impacts in terms of climate are Southeast Asian countries. And so for these countries, not just a matter of like benefiting from the opportunities that are emerging in the rest of the world, but it's a necessity move towards these green industries, creating sectors capable of adapt to climate change is something that is extremely necessary, so that everything that's not just like opportunity, a window of opportunity, but also a necessity for in Vietnam is like all the Mekong Delta, as like we discuss a lot in the other webinars that we'll have and we had will be like highly impacted. So we need to think about like this transition from a more broader perspective, not only looking at the let's say the sunset industries and the industries that are like losing importance, but also the need for creating mechanisms to adapt to climate change. I think there is
any question in
there is
the
a question
audience?
from Michael.
So I don't know if it's I'm not sure whether it's a question or a comment. So saying that some green transition pilot projects must be planned under a national budget in 2023. So I don't know, Guilherme, if you're aware of that.
No.
I confess I don't know. So
no, yeah, I think that's the thing. Like we're talking, of course, like there are pilot projects that we have now for now, and this is a starting point. Like, of course, and we cannot say that this is the main issue when we're talking about like structural change, a rapid structural change in the world. The world is facing, because we never know what are the industries that will in fact or the technologies that will be in fact the technologies that will prevail. As Danilo said, it's like a more Schumpeterian story where like you have to test, you have to identify opportunities, innovate, and in like sometimes and even if you have like some kind of very well-defined industries, to what extent they are coherent with the country's specificities. For example, and there are some technologies that are very important for like very interesting for Japan, but they are not the same. They cannot be just transposed to Vietnam. So we need to think about like these as more like these pilot projects are like and I completely agree that it must be planned under this under like national budgets for sure, but also in the national plan. So it's like and I completely agree with the hydrogen industry. It's something that we don't know, because it's the next question that the next point that emerged. We don't know exactly the path that is gonna fall in the hydrogen industry, but the countries are like really engaged green hydrogen. Countries are really engaged into this because they know that this is like it's now we were creating a path, and we're creating let's say a paradigm And this paradigm of the green hydrogen is something that we need to look at, and it has to be like in the national budget. It has to be in the national plans. I don't know, Danilo, you want to comment on this? You have like hands up.
Yeah, the hands up. Yes, I want to comment on Mike's comment, because that's something that it's quite relevant from what he says, because there has been a lot of research, especially behavioral and experimental research on behavioral economics, doing experiments into trying to understand the climate change impact, and a lot of things in Vietnam as well. So perhaps for following some of the research that has been done, and usually this research is very expensive. The researchers that are doing this, they need to develop this experiment. It takes very long. So pilot projects that are on the national budget that will allow to implement, like they did in Mexico with Oportunidades. They created it, they put it in the national budget. They decided to do an RCT, a randomized control trial in a conditional cash transfers program, and it worked really well. So perhaps putting it in the national budget is the way, because then you allocate some resources to something that may not in the short run give any kind of result, but in terms of what this kind of research can generate in the medium term would be particularly relevant for the green transition. So I think Mike is totally right, because if you even like you know that you can't promise that these projects will work, but if you don't try and you allocate money for that, which is also another problem of political economy, but if you don't allocate that, you will not be able to find a solution. So yes, I think that it is the most interesting way of doing this, and it has many examples in many developing countries, including Vietnam, then these pilot projects work for research and also for implementation of public policy.
Thank you very much to both of you. So we're running out of time. So I would like to thank you both of you again very much. Thank you, Danilo, for your comments and your availability for this webinar. Before we close, I would like to remind you that the next session will be in 2 weeks, so Wednesday, April 12th. And we will deal with different topics, since we will have the pleasure to welcome Professor Thuy Le Toan, who will speak on a rice farming strategy in the Mekong Delta. So based on one of the chapters of the Mekong Special Report of this year. So thank you again to all panelists and the participants, and we hope to see you again in 2 weeks. Have a nice day, everyone.
Thank you, Manuel. Thank you,
Thank you.
Danilo. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank
you
you,
very
everyone.
much. Thank you.
Have a good day. Thank you.